Let me read to you a passage from the 11th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 11 to 15. It's the Gospel for Thursday of the second week in Advent, Year 1. St. Matthew writes, Jesus said, I tell you the truth. Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to accept it, he is the Elijah who was to come. He who has ears, let him hear. That's from Matthew chapter 11, verses 11 to 15. And what does it suggest to us? Well, let us notice the very high praise that our Lord accorded to John the Baptist. Just before this passage that I've just read, we read that as John's disciples were leaving our Lord to give his message to their master who was in prison, our Lord spoke of John. He says, What did you go out into the desert to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in kings' palaces. Then what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is the one about whom it is written, I will send my messenger ahead of you, who will prepare your way before you. That's in chapter 11 of Matthew, verses 1 to 11, in that passage, before the Gospel of today. John was no ordinary prophet. He was the predicted messenger who would prepare the way for the Lord. Other prophets spoke obliquely of the Messiah to come, such as Deutero-Isaiah, who described the suffering servant, or Daniel, who described the Son of Man, or Moses in Deuteronomy, predicting the future prophet. But John's announcement was very specific. He announced to the people that the Messiah was near at hand. Indeed, he said, he was in their midst without their knowing. More than this, at least to some people, he directly pointed to Jesus as the Messiah. For instance, he told this to two of his own disciples, who immediately followed Jesus and became his disciples. And they in turn told others about him and brought them to him. And again, on one occasion we read in the Gospel of St. John, our Lord challenged his enemies to state whether John was from God or not. They knew that if they admitted he was from God, then Jesus would ask why they did not accept John's testimony about him. So, John had testified about Jesus to the leaders of the people also. John was the greatest of the prophets because his mission was the greatest, to introduce Jesus as the Messiah. And there is another reason for his greatness. He bore his sufferings with admirable faith. Though his passion was before that of Jesus, it was born in the same spirit. In our Gospel today that I read, Jesus continues his praise of John the Baptist. He could hardly have given him higher praise, and he does so with solemnity. We read, I tell you the truth, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. Presumably our Lord was not thinking primarily of John's personal holiness, great as this was. After all, Christ's own mother Mary far exceeded John in sanctity. Our Lord would have been referring primarily to his greatness as a prophet and man of the Old Testament. Great in his mission, great in his holiness. He had no equal, and as such his life and teaching pointed superbly to the Messiah who had now arrived. But then our Lord says that something far greater had now come. For he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he, greater than John. That is to say, Whatever the people had of the treasures of heaven in the Old Testament, of which John was the most illustrious prophet, is not to be compared with the treasures and grace available to them in Jesus. In him there is present the kingdom of heaven and every heavenly blessing. What Christ in his person and teaching brings far outstrips what John in his person and teaching brought. John was a prophet, indeed the greatest of the prophets, but Christ was no mere prophet. He was and is a divine person. There was a man in a particular place at a particular time, and he lived out a very human life in a very particular context. He was born, he grew up, he worked, and he died. This man was literally God. Nothing and no one then can compare with him. The entire universe cannot be compared with him. And entry into the kingdom of heaven consists in entering into union with him. Our Lord is saying that union with him in discipleship is a far, far greater thing than the following of any prophet, and even than actually being the greatest of the prophets, and far greater than the Old Testament itself. He, Jesus, is beyond compare. Nothing is to be compared with the priceless treasure of Jesus Christ and union with him. Let us resolve to hold on to the person of Jesus and to guard his teaching, making it the guide of our entire life in all its aspects. Our gospel passage today, Matthew chapter 11, verses 11 to 15, alludes to a passion that John was enduring in prison, a passion that would culminate in his death, bearing witness to the truth of God. He points to Jesus, not only in his prophetic mission, but in his own passion and death. Let us be led by his witness to take our stand with Jesus, and be led entirely by his teaching, a teaching that leads us to take up our cross and carry it in following in his footsteps.